Be a lot of fun. So here we are in the middle or toward the end, actually, of the series called Be Calm and Read Psalms. Now, we're going to cover a psalm today that's a little bit unusual in the respects that it has a backstory that's a little bit tougher to kind of talk about, but we're going to dive into it anyway. And I actually like this. I like that when you read the Bible, what you get is honesty. You don't get candy-coated kind of, everything's going to be all right. You get honesty when you read the Bible. Honesty about who God is. God is a God that is loving us and that is pursuing us. He's not willing that any should perish and all should come to life. And so you have this God in pursuit, but you also have this God that has expectations, that says, listen, this is about surrender of your life to me. And the Bible is very honest and clear about both those aspects about who God is. He loves us, He wants the best for us, but requires surrender. And so there's an honest picture of God in the Bible. There's also an honest picture of us. When you read the Bible, kind of checking out who the people are, the characters, most of our favorite characters. Think of your favorite character, not Disney. Think of your favorite biblical character. All right, you probably know some good things and bad things about them. Because that's what the Bible does. It tells us all the good stuff. Hey, this is the amazing things they did. But it also is very honest about some of their faults and their failures. And the guy that we're going to look at today is no different than that. And I love that. Because it helps me know, it reminds me that God uses imperfect people. I think sometimes we get caught up in our mind and our thought that, I'm not perfect. I have faltered and I failed. And so, God uses you preacher types, or God uses you Bible study leader types, or God uses those folks that have it together way more than I do. And when you read His Word and you hear these stories, you realize that God uses some really, really messed up folks. And people that have struggled and faltered and failed in ways that you probably could never imagine, or if you did, you'd get in trouble if you raised your hand and you said, I imagine that. So, today's story is just that. We're going to dive in and take a look at a guy that was both good and bad, and it was David. He's the guy that we know, King David in the Old Testament. He wrote 23rd Psalms. The Lord is my shepherd. It was an amazing psalm that he wrote that he did. We also know about David that he was the giant killer when no one else was willing to go out and face Goliath. David, as a little boy, a young man, ran out with a sling and sling, whatever noise that makes, and he killed the giant. And so we know that story about him, that he was the king, that he did all these amazing things. And so we know so many good things about David and who he was, but we also know the bad. And when David stumbles, it's like when David is good, he's really good. But when he falters, man, he just falls off a cliff. And that's a little bit of the story we're going to unpack today, how David, the Bible says, a man after God's own heart. Imagine God saying that about you, a man or a woman after God's own heart, that even that guy faltered and failed in a way that honestly impacted his life, and we're going to talk about that. In that story, David is going to recover. David is going to recover and reconnect with God, which I think is important for all of us to hear. And as he's recovering, he's actually going to write 7 psalms during this time. But the most powerful of those 7 psalms is Psalm 51. It's kind of his moment where he just stops and just talks with God about what he needs to do to get back on his feet. And so that's our story. That's where we're going to go today, Psalms 51. And if you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and turn there. We'll end up there, but we're going to start actually in 2 Samuel with the story. Because some of you guys are very curious. I know David like giant killer, but I don't know David falter failure guy. What happened, Jim? What's the story? Well, it picks up in the later part of David's life. Not too late, but it's later years. He's achieved everything that he wanted to achieve. Can you imagine that? All the goals that you had in kindergarten to not potty train, all those goals you had in kindergarten and junior high and high school, marry the person you want to marry, have the great job, the 401k, everything had totally worked out for David. Now, he'd had some ups and downs. Saul tried to kill him. Okay, that's not a good day. But still, he had finally achieved it. David was crowned king of this nation, and people are like, David, we love you, you're awesome. And he was just rolling in that adulation. It was an amazing time for David. And he was just hanging out. It was like life could not get any better. He didn't even have tan lines. The guy, he was just rocking. I mean, everything in life was going well. And so it was in this time that he was living the dream, that the promise was fulfilled, that something happened and went on. And we're going to pick that story up in 2 Samuel. This is his story of a falter and failure. This is 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. So David's king, everything is going great, and here it is. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, so that's part of what kings did. You're king, you had a responsibility. Your responsibility was go with your men to war and battle to make sure, the people that lived on the outskirts of your area were staying safe and those kind of things. And so when the kings were off taking care of their people, doing what they were supposed to do in war and battle, David sent Joab out with the king's men, his guys, and said, "Hey, Joab, why don't you just take care of this for me?" And the whole Israelite army, they all went out, and they destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rahab. But David, this last part, but David remained in Jerusalem. Now, to me, when I think about this story, this is where it starts going downhill for David, because David is not where he needs to be. As king, what God has given him, his role is to be out there with his men, fighting, protecting. That's what God said. Hey, this is my will for you, David. I want you to be out there doing that thing. But David, he opts for the pajama party. He's kind of hanging at the house in his Snuggie. It's just nice, it's warm, it's comfortable. And he's not where he's supposed to be. And you remember last week, Psalms 23, if you missed it, I totally tell you to go back and podcast it. We talked about something that David said at the very first part of Psalms 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And we talked about contentment and how contentment wasn't about being satisfied and comfortable, because David in his castle was very satisfied. David was very comfortable. So contentment isn't about being satisfied and comfortable. In fact, you're going to discover that David, obviously, even that place wasn't very content. Content is all about being in God's will and pursuing it and having the peace that even if David found himself on the middle of a battlefield raging around him, he was content because he was where he was supposed to be with God. That is contentment. And so in the middle of this place where David is surrounded by comfort and satisfaction and everything at his fingertips, he finds himself discontent. He finds himself in want, and the story begins to unfold. Verse 2. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace, and from the roof he saw a beautiful woman, or he saw a woman, and the woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "Hey, isn't that like Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Hey, David, come on, you know who this is. And then David sent messengers to her, and she came to him, and he slept with her after she had purified herself from her uncleanness, and then she went back home. Dave, what in the world did you just do? Here we are, you're the king of Israel, you're the one that God says you're a man after my own heart, and yet you have faltered and failed in a way that we would look at and say, you could have had anything, David. More wives, you could have had them. That would be crazy. I can't hardly handle the one of God. You want more of those? But here it is. Anything else you want? Dave, you could have anything, but you saw something and you wanted it, even though she was married, and you took it. And we're looking at this going, David, how could you? Now, whenever I read this part of the story, honestly, here's where I go. I stop and I recognize this truth. No one is above temptation. I run across people all the time say, "Oh yeah, I won't struggle with that, Jim. Oh yeah, my marriage is just fine. No, I'm good. I'm good. No need to pray for me in that area." No one is above temptation. No one is above mistakes. No one is above faltering and failure. None of us. Not even me especially. And that keeps me on guard knowing that truth. I'll give a shout out to our singles that are here, that are in the dating scene. First, have standards. Make the list. This is what I'm looking for in a person. And then actually live that list. And I say that simply because it can get lonely. I didn't get married till I was 27. There were 26 years that I thought, I wish there was someone for me. And I understand that lonely side. And what you can do is you go, boy, this list is not doing anything for my Friday night. I can scratch off 7, 4, and 3 and probably have fun this weekend. And so I would encourage you, don't compromise the list because you're not above a bad relationship. You're not above meeting someone that's maybe fun on Friday but has no desire to engage with you with who God is on Sunday. And you can find yourself in trouble. I don't know how much marriage counseling I do that starts with that one truth. I had standards, I compromised, and now I am in a mess. You're not above a bad relationship. Married folk, and we're kind of laughing at this thing, was going, oh yeah, you're not. Trust me, you're not. But for us, men, don't stop pursuing your wives. I know you captured her and you convinced her to say I do, and that's a glory moment for a lot of us. Don't stop pursuing your wife. It's a part of what we need to be doing because she is not above fault or failure and mistakes, and neither are you. Keep pursuing her. If you can't remember really your last date night, I think it was the Monster Truck show. I gave her a quart of oil for her car. I'm a stud. So if that's what you're remembering in your brain, then I would say you're overdue. You're overdue for pursuing your wife. Get after that because she is not above someone else coming in and capturing her heart. So fellas, get after it. If you don't remember the last time you said I love her, or better yet, if you have not said I loved you to your wife this morning, you're behind. Take a moment, fellas. Do what you need to do. Some of you did. We're not a college frat house. Don't get crazy. But still, today, say I love you to your wife. Engage in that every day because we're not above temptation. We're not above failure. Ladies, do you understand this truth that everything in this world is trying to capture your husband's heart? You better be after it on a daily basis. His job is trying to capture his heart and have him focus on there and give it time and energy. And his boss is there saying, make this work. Our sexualized society has spent millions and millions and millions of dollars to try to capture his heart away from you. It seems like everything is set on pulling the guy's heart away from his wife and his kids and his family. Wives, pursue your man. On a daily basis, be engaging his heart, whether it's a text message or a letter or an email or his favorite dinner or just, honey, thank you. Thank you that you go to work and you try to provide for this family. Thank you. None of us are above temptation. None of us are above fault and failure. And so when I read this piece of the story, it always reminds me to be in pursuit. Be in pursuit of the things that matter, the things of God, the things of relationship and family. And if you don't get anything else today, get that. Be in pursuit of the things that matter. And so here's David. He's in this journey. He has faltered and failed, and he's done this thing. Verse 5. Then the woman conceived. And sent word to David and said, I'm pregnant. This is David's Jerry Springer moment. Here he is, the reveal. He thought he got away with it. He had done this thing, and he sent her home, and he sends back the letter, and the letter says, I'm pregnant, and this is your baby. And David is in this moment going, what do I do? I've got to figure this whole thing out. What are my options? And David starts thinking about the cover-up. You ever done that? And yes, we all have. You start thinking about the cover-up. How can I cover this thing up? What can I do? I was in junior high, and I remember my worst cover-up. We had 3 rules in our family. Don't hit your sister, make curfew, which I thought was totally silly and never did. But the 3rd rule was pretty important. Don't play with fire. I don't know why they said that rule, but they did. So junior high, my friend comes over, Terry Sexton. His dream was to become a firefighter, which he eventually did. He shouldn't have based on this one experience. But we were at the house. It's like 2 o'clock in the morning. We're not asleep. We're junior hires dorking around, and we're going to break rule number 2. And so we go outside with the lighter, no curfew, and he says, hey, let's just start like a little fire and see if we can put it out. I want to be a firefighter when I grow up. And I was like, sweet, that's awesome, let's do it. And so we do. We start a little fire, we run around, stomp it out. We're good, we're awesome. And a little bigger, let's let it get a little bigger. Says, oh yeah. And so this thing just starts progressing. And if you lived anywhere in Alabama or the southern states, pine trees, they drop their needles. They're evergreens, but they drop their needles and they totally dry out in the summertime. It's just crazy. And we had this pine straw in our backyard, huge backyard. We lived on 10 acres. And so we started doing it and backing up, farther and farther to see if, how good we were at putting out a big fire. Well, I remember the moment. that the edge of that fire touched the pine straw. I think I wet myself when it happened. It went up like crazy. You would have thought we'd dumped gasoline out there, and all of a sudden this huge wall of flame just shoots up and it spreads like crazy. It just sweeps the backyard. Whoa. And I turned to Terry and go, Terry, you got to put it out. You want to be a firefighter. So we jump up and we run. We grab the water hose. We cut it on. This is like 2:30 in the morning that no one saw. This is amazing because our yard is glowing. And so we put it out and we're stomping around, shovel. I mean, it was we finally get the thing out. It burned all the way up to the house. We finally get the fire put out. And we're like, oh my gosh, okay. Let's cover this stuff up because we're in trouble. But it's pitch black, so we can't really see the damage. We just know, let's put away the water hose. Let's hide the lighter. And let's change our clothes because we smell like smoke and dirt. And then they will never, ever know. I was not the sharpest tool in the shed growing up. A few fries short of a Happy Meal. So here I was. We went to bed. We're exhausted. And then my stepdad comes in at 8 o'clock in the morning, gets us up and says, I want to show you something. We're like, oh, yeah, sweet, yes, okay. So we go out, and he opens the back door. The whole backyard is completely black. It is burned pitch. And his question, which I think it was very legitimate at the time, was, what happened? And so we're caught. I mean, there's nothing we can do about that. We thought we had covered it up. We thought we had done everything, and we were going to get away with this. But the evidence was scorched ground. Now, to finish the rest of the story, in case it encourages any of you younger folks, we both got tore up, I think 7 times. Every time he'd remember it, he'd come in with a belt. It's like, yeah, where's Alzheimer's when you need it? You need to forget this moment right here. So it was just a crazy time. And we see this with David. David does the same thing. He has this moment where everything is crazy, and then he tries the cover-up. I just need to cover this whole thing up. And so what he thinks he's going to do, he's going to call Bathsheba's husband back. He's doing his job. Uriah, he's out there on the battlefield, fighting the battle, doing his thing. David, you're my king. I'm following you. David calls Uriah back and says, Uriah, I want you to take a break. I want you to go hang out. You've worked really hard for me. A lot of people believe that Uriah was one of David's top 10 guys, top 20, 30 guys, and because he's been with David for a long time. And says, just go take a break. Go hang out with your wife. Enjoy an evening on me. Uriah doesn't. Uriah says, I'm a warrior, and you have called my fellow men out to the battlefield. And where David wasn't, Uriah wanted to go back there. So he literally sleeps at David's door, does not go back out. And so David wakes up the next morning thinking, I've covered it. And he walks out, and he sees Uriah laying there, and he asks his servant, did he go home? And they say, no, he didn't. His servants know what's going on. So the next night, David says, all right, I gotta work on this plan. And he literally, this is all in the story, he literally takes Uriah and says, Uriah, you're a great guy. I love having you here. Let's have a little bit of a party. And so he gets Uriah drunk, thinking that a drunk Uriah will eventually stumble his way home, and even if he doesn't remember the night, he can totally claim that this child is probably Uriah's, and he's good to go. Man, how deep is this rabbit hole going? It's just the way it happens with sin sometimes in our life and what goes on. And so Uriah gets drunk, and he does that, but he doesn't go home. He still lays at the foot of David's door because of his loyalty and his devotion to David, his king, his brother, his friend. David wakes up the next morning and says, did he go home? No, he laid right here. Then it gets dark. David says, there's only one thing I have left to do. And so he says, Uriah, you're going to go back to the battle, and I want to give you a letter. Now, don't read this letter, Uriah. It's sealed, and I want you to give it to your commander. This is what the letter says. This is 1 Samuel, or 2 Samuel 11:15. It says this. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, the commander, and sent it with Uriah. And in that letter, this is what David wrote. Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so that he will be struck down and die. Serious business. The man after God's own heart, giant killer, slayer, this amazing man of God, has done this horrifically crazy thing. And it should shock you just a little bit, because I read this story and go, seriously, how did this happen to David? And I remember that thought that not any of us are above temptation and following the path of selfishness and sin, especially when we try to cover up. And David does something that I think we all do. He tries to ignore the issue. That thing that he did, and as crazy it is, he just tries to ignore it. He can't cover it up. It's done it, and he's just hoping people didn't notice, and so he tries to cover this whole thing up. And when he writes the 51st Psalm, you're going to see him write about things that were going on in his heart during this time. You're going to see him write about how his joy was gone, totally ripped out of him. David, the man that used to dance before God with passion and joy and used to worship with both hands raised, no longer had joy and passion, and selfishness. And sin will do that to us. Man, it'll totally rip out our joy and passion. It will replace it with anger and depression. When we got those things in our life that we just hide and we cover up, and David was totally there, and he had lost his joy and was wrestling with these things. You're going to see him get angry here in just a minute. It made David feel stained. You'll see David writing in the 51st Psalm that I felt stained. What does that mean? He felt spiritually worthless, like a failure. Like he shouldn't be leading this people. He shouldn't be engaged. He shouldn't be doing the things that he's doing, and we've all been there, where we faltered and failed, and we've got that stain on us, and we look and go, you know what, I don't even think I should go or could go or need to go be at church today, because I'm just so stained. David felt those things, and for a whole year, he wrestled. For a whole year, he kept it covered up, and he wrestled with this and everything going on in his life, and thankfully, God said it can't stay this way. It cannot stay this way for you. One, David, some things have to be answered for. You're a leader, and you need to answer for some things. But secondly, your heart is dark, and it's only getting darker, and you've lost the very thing that you loved about life, and you're just getting bitter and angry and depressed. David, this is going to be painful, but I need to rescue you. And so God presses in, and he sends a prophet, a guy named Nathan, to talk to Daniel. And so this is what Nathan does. Nathan shows up, and he gets an audience with David, and David's like, yeah, come on in. And this is a year later after the whole event. And so Nathan comes in, and this is what he says. This is chapter 12, verse 1. Nathan decides to tell David a story. And then the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him, and he said, hey, Dave, there were two men in a certain town. One was very rich, and the other was poor. Now the rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except for this one little ewe lamb that he bought. You can imagine David as a shepherd was totally resonating with this story. He's like, oh, well, I get that little bitty lamb. And that rich guy, he had a whole bunch, and that poor guy, he only had one. I get what that feels like. And this poor guy, he raised that little lamb, and it grew up with him, and it was his children. And it shared his food, and it drank from his cup, and it even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. This poor man had one lamb, and he loved it. No kids. Everything was poured onto this lamb and this sheep. Now a traveler came to the rich man. But the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and killed it and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David the shepherd, David the man who had a heart that really actually cared for people, David burned with anger against this rich man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. Here's the moment. Verse 7, then Nathan said to David, and I can imagine just how the room felt, David, you are that man. And in a moment, everything laid bare. How painful for David, the thing that he'd been covering up, the thing that he'd been trying to hold on to, just stripped out from in front of him. And David just falls on his face before Nathan and says, Nathan, you are so right. I deserve exactly what I said this man deserved. And he just falls on his face before David. The truth is finally out. As painful as this moment is for David and everybody realizes it, this is David's start toward freedom. It's his start toward hope. And that's the way it is for anything that's broken, especially the things that are broken that are covered up, the things that we try to ignore, the things that we do to distract us, shopping, eating, food, TV, the things that we use to distract ourselves from the broken things inside of us. The truth is, broken things don't get better on their own. Time does heal, but it's the process of doing the work, of making sure our hearts are good with each other, making sure our hearts are good with God. And here is David in his moment when he has to make it right. Make it right with God, make it right with people. Now here's the good part of this story. As epic as this fail is for David, and I cannot think of any other more epic fail of anyone that I know, as epic as this fail is, David recovers. David recovers in his relationship with people. David recovers in his relationship with God. Now, there are still consequences. You read this story, and you're going to see some really tough consequences. David has some consequences in his family. He has some consequences in life. But David recovers. And I put that out there for all of us. No matter what kind of fail you have in your life, no matter what thing has gone on that you maybe have spent a lifetime covering up, big, little, doesn't matter. God can bring redemption to you. He's in the business of doing that. And bringing your heart right with others and making your heart right with Him. And in fact, in the few moments that I have left here, I'm just going to give you a couple of things out of Psalms 51 that talks about how David discovered redemption with God. Psalms 51 says this. This is David writing this after the event, after he began to recover in his connection to God and from this event in his life. It says this, Psalms 51, verse 1. And we'll just do verse 1. It says this. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. Underline that. According to your great compassion. Underline that. Blot out all my transgressions. David knew the heart of God. He knew the unfailing love. He knew the great compassion of God. He knew that if he could throw himself on that, he would be okay. And I would put that out there for each and every one of us. The unfailing love, the great compassion of God. Sometimes we look at God and God's heart and we think God is judgmental and God is angry and God is fierce and God is rah. But David says that's not God. God is loving and God is compassionate and He is a God even in our worst failures. David murdered a guy so he could have his wife. Even in our greatest failure, David said, God, if I fall in your arms, you will catch me. And David does, and he falls into his arms, and God catches him. Now, God is very adamant about the truth, and in fact, you see this in verse 6. Surely you desire truth in the inward parts. You teach me wisdom in the inmost place. But God takes truth, and He presents us with truth, and He shows us. Remember, the Bible is absolutely honest about God and absolutely honest about ourselves. And so God will hold up the mirror and let us see our brokenness. But He doesn't do it to break us. He does it to redeem us, to get us to the point where we say, God, you are right. And He brings that truth, and right around the corner comes love and compassion. And He picks us up, and He holds us. It's a beautiful thing. Some people see God as just truth. That's all He is, and He's going to hammer me for it. He's more than that. He's truth and love. Some people just see God as love. He's loving, He's compassionate. It doesn't matter what I do. He is more than that. He's love and truth. And David fell into that. God's love and truth. And he said, God, that's a part of your nature. I'm going to depend on that. The second thing that David does here, it's in verse 3, is David gets honest with God. He says this, for I know my transgressions and my sin is always before me. He said, God, listen, I know what I have done. No excuses. I'm not going to blame this on the fact that she should have covered up more. I'm not going to blame this on the fact that I shouldn't have been up on the roof. I'm not going to make excuses. David just simply said, God, it's me. And I faltered and I failed. And he brings his brokenness, his junk to God. and he says, I just need you to take care of this. Now, here's an intriguing thing. It's something that I love about God. A lot of us feel like we do that and God's just going to crush us. There's no way that God's going to love me if he saw the darkness in my heart and my soul or the things I've done in my life. And David writes this in verse 16 and 17 of this psalm. God, you do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You don't delight in pleasures of burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. Oh God, those are the things that you will not despise. God simply responds to our brokenness. If you're willing to come to him and say, I have messed up, God says, I got it. I'm not looking for you to give more, for you to attend more, for you to do more. I'm looking for you to just bring your heart to me and say, I've messed up. And I need, Father, for you to make this right. God says, that I won't despise, that I won't crush, that I won't press against. I will take that broken thing and I will begin to mend it. Are there consequences? For sure. We live in a world full of consequences, but God can take broken things and crazy consequences, and he can turn them for our good, for his good, the kingdom's good. That's what David leaned on. And the last one I would simply say is this. David asked God to do something specific. Look at verse 2, 7, and 10. This is what David says to God. He says, God, 1, wash me from all iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. And in verse 7, cleanse me with a hyssop and I'll be clean. Wash me and I'll be whiter than snow. And then verse 10, he says, create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit in me. This is the truth that David fell on. He simply knew that God had the power to free him from guilt. A whole year holding in his heart the fact that he had an affair, killed the man, and still went on as life is normal. Can you imagine what was going on in the heart and soul of David? How brutally bitter that must have been for him to be the king in front of everyone, but to know what was in the closet. And so David simply says, God, I want you to clean this stuff out. And he comes before God, and he experiences from God freedom from guilt, cleansing of his soul. And he said, God, if you will do this, and God says, I want to do it. It's the one thing that God for sure desires to do. God cleanses his soul, frees him from guilt, gives him life. And I would say this for us, this is not just an issue of really big things. There's one or two of you in the room that would go, oh, okay, this covers me. I have done some really crazy big things in life. But I want you to know this applies to even the little things. I've found in my own life this, that I don't fall away from God in one huge epic failure. That doesn't tend to happen, and I think that's the way it is for most of us. It's not just right off the cliff. I wake up sometimes, and I look around and go, where am I, God? Where are you? Because of all the small little steps that I've taken. Just one more selfishness, just one more my way, just one more. Something that I want to do, just one more. Jen, you just need to suck it up and be okay with this. Just one more. I'm angry at the kids. And before I know it, 1,000 steps have taken me so far away from God that I'm in a desert. This, I think, defines a lot of us. Here's the hope. That God says, you can recover in just one. And that one step is simply saying, God, forgive me. God, wash me. God, I mess up in this life. Can you just make this thing right in my soul? The God of the universe has power to do that. And he offers that to each and every single one of us. There was nothing special about David. He was imperfect. He faltered. He failed. God redeemed him. He did some even greater things after this than he did before this. And God offers that to each and every one of you. Kind of just starts, honestly, with what I started with this morning. You know what my prayer was this morning? God, I faltered and failed. Can I just have some fresh forgiveness? And I made my list. And it was such a powerful experience. So I can stand before you guys, not perfect by any means, but fresh. Clean and pure as the driven snow, because that's what God does. And what he offers each of us. We're going to have a few moments here where we take communion. And maybe before we do this, you just take some time to go before God and say, God, let's you and I talk. You dump some things out to him. You just simply say, can you just help me be clean? Maybe it's triggered an I'm sorry that you need to say to someone today. A letter you might need to write to begin to make relationships right in your life. We can talk more about that in the coming months. In February, we're going to talk about a relationship series. Right now, just do business with God and see how he takes guilt and pain and frustration and anger, depression out of your life and replaces it with joy. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, my prayer this morning was that you would cleanse me and make me whiter than snow, and I'm so thankful that you did. I ask that you reveal to us, hold up that mirror that we hate. Oh, I do not like your mirror. Hold up that mirror that we hate, but that we need. Show us where we've broken ourselves, where we faltered and failed, and let us lean into that. Don't let pride capture us this morning. Let us just fall on your grace and your love and your mercy and your compassion and say, Father, make me clean, make me right. Renew your spirit in me, Father. Give me my joy back that I lost a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, 10 years ago. Restore that in me, Father. Let that be our prayer. Holy Spirit, move on us to talk to you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.